I'm Rosemary Ruff. I'm the Director of Research Compliance, and my office oversees compliance issues that have to do with research, U.S. export controls, human subjects regulations, animal care and use, toxic substances, radiation safety. The feds seem to particularly enjoy giving laws out that make universities cringe, so somebody has to ride herd on them. We're talking today about research integrity, and the first thing that people want to know is, what is it? And this is, without a doubt, the best definition that I've seen. Responsible conduct in research is simply good citizenship applied to professional life. That was written by a man called Nicholas Stenick, who happens to be an expert on responsible conduct of research and research ethics, in a booklet that was published by the Office of Research Integrity. Research integrity has rules, it has guidelines, and so there are lots of things to think about when you're talking about research integrity. It's not just something that's lawful or unlawful, it's the right thing to do. We have professional codes, we have government regulations, we have institutional policies, and we have the hardest one to define, which is personal responsibility. Personal responsibility is more difficult because it relies on ethics and morals. And if you've had ethics classes, you know that what is ethical in one culture may not be ethical in another, yet morally things seem to be the same across a broad spectrum. Examples of the professional codes that we have are, for instance, the Chemist Code of Conduct, which is for the American Chemical Society. Psychologists, the American Psychological Association has the ethical principles for psychologists. Oral history group has not just the principles, but also some best practices, some what would you do, what should you do type things. Unfortunately, not every discipline has codes developed. And so there's some latitude between what one group feels is acceptable and what another group feels is acceptable, and what an individual decides on his or her own. We have some comprehensive codes for those who don't have codes developed that have been put out by various organizations. The National Academy of Sciences, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, Sigma Xi, which is the science honor. And then we have government regulations, and I'm not even going to try to go through the dozens of them. But the ones that affect us most here are the Animal Welfare Act, which deals with vertebrate animal use. We don't worry about earthworms with this, we don't worry about amoeba with this, we worry only with vertebrate animals. We have the Health Research Extension Act, which builds upon the Animal Welfare Act that was put out by the Department of Health and Human Services, that covers vertebrate animals in biomedical and behavioral research. And we have the National Research Act, which started the Human Subjects Guidelines. We also have something called the Good Laboratory Practices Act. And I'm sure you've heard of the Food and Drug Administration. And you see on TV a lot that the FDA has approved this or recalled that or whatever. Before you get to the point that you get FDA approval or something, whether it's a device or a drug or some other substance, you have to test it, and they have some standards called the Good Laboratory Practices Act. And without testing under those standards, the FDA ordinarily will not approve whatever it is that you're wanting to eventually get to market. And then we have a thing called the America Competes Act, which is fairly recent. It was passed only a few years ago, and it was passed with the intent that we would compete with technology development around the world. We felt like we were losing our edge, or the politicians did. And built into that America Competes Act, which has lots of other things, were requirements for training in research integrity at schools like this. And so that's why you're invited here today, or at least partially why you're invited here today. We get funding from various federal agencies. Pick an agency, we've probably had funding from them. National Science Foundation, National Institutes of Health, USDA are the most common ones, but there are dozens of them. National Endowment for the Arts, National Endowment for the Humanities, the Smithsonian Libraries, NASA, the list goes on and on. And every one of those sponsors has, to some extent, a policy that requires responsible conduct of research training before you can access funds that are awarded to support your research. They also require that we have policies for investigating alleged research misconduct. And I will say, and we'll get into it a little bit more later, that research misconduct is in the research integrity umbrella, but research misconduct and research integrity are not the same things. Research misconduct is a subset of what would be considered a breach of integrity with regard to research. They also have policies which require us to report findings of alleged research misconduct, and then the federal government, thinking that wasn't quite enough and trying to bring everybody together, passed a federal policy on research misconduct that the Office of Science and Technology Policy is now beginning to implement. And it essentially does the same thing that NSF, NIH, and the others have done for years with regard to what's required, but it's eliminating, hopefully, the little idiosyncrasies between the groups. Like some do it electronically, some do it hard copy, some need 4 copies, some need 7 witnesses, some don't need any witnesses outside that which is found in the investigation. So they're trying very hard to, in some way, get everybody on the same page with that. We also have institutional policies. And obviously, you already know, or I think you do, about the Academic Integrity and Initiatives Policy. But we also have a thing called UA Research and Scholarly Misconduct Policy, and we have a Conflict of Interest and Conflict of Commitments Policy. All of those things speak toward academic integrity, or research integrity in the academic arena. How do those get implemented? Who oversees it? Again, probably you've already figured this out, that in most cases there are boards and committees that have various representatives on them. And for some of the research ones, we have something a little different than the Academic Integrity and Initiatives Policy has, in that we have community members serving on those to represent how the community would feel about a given research activity. We didn't do that out of the goodness of our heart, I have to admit. Federal regulations require that for some of these boards and committees. The federal regulations that protect humans require at least 1 community member. The federal regulations that cover recombinant DNA research require at least 2 community members on it. But in some way, shape, or form, they're charged, those committees are charged with reviewing actions and activities and recommending appropriate follow-through, whether it's to allow research to go forward, to recommend that it be halted, to ask for a change in it before it goes, or whatever. And then we have a whole bunch of administrative professionals. And you've probably heard us complained about numerous times. We're the paper pushers. Most of the compliance professionals here on campus actually have degrees or certifications in their fields. So they've actually spent a whole bunch of time learning the regulations and procedures and so forth in one given area. Then we come to that part which is actually the largest part, personal responsibility. Rules and policies can only set minimum standards, and they can only identify a few potential issues. You can't ever write a policy that covers everything that might come up. That's when it comes in that as an individual, you do, quote, the right thing. And I call it giving it the front page test. If I do this, would I be upset if they put it on the front page of the paper tomorrow? Some people call it the capital steps test, especially if they get state funding. Would you want the legislature to know that that was going on at your institution? And the last is, can you actually live with the consequences of your decision? Say you see somebody committing misconduct by falsifying data on a drug meant to treat children, and for whatever reason you decide not to turn it in. I might be mistaken, I might not get to graduate, I don't think it's that big a deal because the drug's not going anywhere. Can you live with what happens from that decision a year, 10, 20 years down the road? The thing that I find to be most true is that with careful planning, you will minimize most of the ethical issues that come up. Policies and procedures are written, regulations are written, it's pretty clear what you should do. It's those gray areas that give people problems, and with some planning, you can actually avoid having to confront some issues before they become problems. We'll start with research misconduct because, as I told you, that's just a portion of research integrity. Research misconduct, as far as the federal government goes, and as far as most state and local governments and so forth go, restrict the definition to fabrication, falsification, or plagiarism with regard to proposing, reporting, performing, or reviewing research results. Sometimes an agency will say that you have to apply it only to their funds, whether that's your state fish and game or whether that's your NSF or your NIH. The university here applies its research misconduct policy to every research project, no matter who funded it. Whether it was a SURF proposal that got funded, whether it was your grad student assistantship that helped fund it, whether it was National Science Foundation, we treat it all the same. Fabrication is actually making up data or results and recording them or reporting them. You don't have time to run yet one more set of gels. And so you go, okay, I'll just fake the measurements because the first 10 sets I ran came out exactly the same. The spots were in exactly the same place, so I'll just pretend and I'll make them up. That's fabrication of data. Fabricating the hemoglobin and hematocrit in a sample from your rat blood when you didn't run it. Same thing. Falsification is a little bit different. That's when you manipulate things to make them what you want them to be. When you manipulate the standards for your gas chromatograph so that you'll get the peak to come out in the right place, or where you have really nice data points for the first 20 times you've done something, and then you get 2 data points that are outlying, and you go, I don't know what I did wrong, I'll just ignore those. That's a very common thing to do. The appropriate thing to do is to report them, and if you can identify why they're outliers, do so and then exclude them based on sound principles. But to just ignore them completely and say nobody will ever know, that's falsification. Anything that means that the record isn't accurately represented. Western blots, when you take photos, drawing in extra lines of felt tip marker on the gel before you do that, or drawing it in on the photo and rephotographing it. Plagiarism gets to be tough. Most people think plagiarism is copy and paste off of the web, or copying things out of a book while you sit there and type it verbatim. That's only one form of plagiarism. Plagiarism is also stealing somebody's ideas. if they talk to you in the hallway about them, if they meet you at a professional meeting and you take it and run with their ideas, that can be plagiarism. You can use other people's ideas and words as long as you give them appropriate credit. And of course, as long as there's not some legal obligation like a confidentiality agreement not to. What is the difference between misconduct and integrity? Well, misconduct is just one small part of integrity. Misconduct actually appears to be relatively uncommon. The two largest funding agencies, if you don't count DOD, which does a lot of research, NSF and PHS report that it's less than 0.1% of all the projects they fund each year. It's often criminal in nature. There's often something in that misconduct that is prosecutable, not just a civil activity. And as I said before, no misconduct is a minimum standard. There just won't be any. Well, how much in that case is tolerable? I mean, they don't even address it. Integrity, there's no mandatory reporting. Whereas with misconduct, we're obligated to have policy and a procedure and to report on the outcome of that and so forth. Integrity usually isn't criminal behavior. Just because you're mad at your neighbor and you call him names, as long as you don't threaten him, that's not criminal behavior. Often it's an ethical dilemma. Research integrity often is an ethical dilemma. To go back to the example that I used about not running a set of, another set of some experiment to get the points that you need. And you see that your lab partner is working right along, running short of time. The mentor tells him to do it one more time just to be sure. And he doesn't show up, or she doesn't show up in the lab that night, but reports the data the next morning. And you happen to know for a fact that he wasn't in the lab because you were there. And you're going, do I or don't I? Well, that's an ethical issue. And depending on a policy or a sponsor's requirements, might also be a misconduct issue. Could be one or both. The other thing that makes the ethical dilemmas so hard to deal with, as I've said, is that practices vary by discipline. What's perfectly all right in one discipline may not be all right in another. Have you had some speakers on authorship? No? The way that authors are named varies greatly from discipline to discipline. We're just now getting to the point where they're looking at a global approach to that, so that if you don't, that what we call honorary authorship is going out the window, hopefully. There was a point in time when the department head's name went on every publication in every discipline, no matter whether the department head ever saw it or not. There are still times when pharmaceutical companies publish white papers about some new product, and they write the white paper, and they go to a scientist and they say, how about you read this through and we let you claim it as yours? It's called ghostwriting. And that individual may or may not have ever had anything to do with the research. He may be a subject matter expert in the field. But it all boils down again to integrity. I mean, if somebody says to you, here, I've written this, you can have it, you can claim it, you're not violating a copyright law. But claiming somebody else's work, especially if it espouses how wonderful a new drug is when you don't really know that, is an ethical issue until they get sued. Some questions that I thought you might like to cover, and since we've got two people here, they'll have lots of answers for us. Do you think research misconduct should include more things than fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism? Should any of these other issues be rolled into what is considered misconduct? Burning somebody's lab book Should that be misconduct?
Well, that's destruction of property, right? So that'd be a different issue, I think.
That's why I'm asking questions, yeah. Are there other things that you can think of that would be misconduct? Well, you're not alone if you're having trouble.
I'm not sure. Well, and really, I was thinking as you were talking about the fabrication and the falsification too, those are so, I guess sort of easily done behind closed doors that I wonder how, even though we've got the policies on them, how difficult or how easy those things might be to actually pinpoint anyway. I think the plagiarism to a certain extent might be easier to identify. And I mean, I haven't done any of this, but I'm just sort of thinking hypothetically, because at least with the plagiarism, if they're taking someone's ideas and you're an expert in that field, you can say, well, no, Dr. So-and-so already
said that.
talked about this.
You're exactly right. You recognize the source.
Yeah.
And so, especially today with all of the software that we have to run things through and the fact that lots of media is now available online at little or no cost, whereas journals used to cost much more than a lot of people could afford, it was hard to identify. But these days it is, of the three, probably the most easily identified. The fabrication and the falsification depend on interaction with other people. And somebody paying attention to what's going on in the lab. And so every person in that lab has an obligation to pay attention to what's going on. For instance, a lot of equipment stores the data right then and there. It has some kind of a data logger in it. And so you see from somebody's checking the data logger and sees that nothing was run on the day that that's written in a lab book, that sort of thing. So it is more difficult to pinpoint the other two.
Well, and it doesn't sound like, from your example too, it doesn't sound like there's any sort of mandatory reporting. So if I am that other person in the lab, right, you kind of framed it in this ethical dilemma versus a misconduct.
I did because, yes, there may be mandatory reporting. If you have federal funding, those federal agencies all require you to report suspected as well as known research misconduct. And in addition to that, the university policy on misconduct says that anybody who knows or has reason to suspect is obligated to report misconduct. So that's a burden that's placed on everybody's shoulders that is as much an ethical issue for you as it is an integrity, as it is a misconduct issue for the university. If you don't report research misconduct when you see it, are you guilty of research misconduct? No. You may be guilty of a policy violation, but as long as research misconduct is confined to those three things, then you're not. Should you be penalized if you don't report?
And how would someone know?
To find out that actually that happens quite a bit. To find out that you were in the lab when somebody did something. Or to find out later that they confided in you or asked you, to in some way be quiet about it, they were going to have to do it. Lots of reasons why people enter into misconduct. A busy night, a bad budget, a very ill spouse or children that limits your time. I mean, things come up. We're all humans. We have things happen to us. The general consensus is that not reporting, like I said, is not misconduct. But in some cases, there are policies and there are regulations where you can be penalized for not reporting it. If people are convicted of research misconduct on a federal project, should they be stopped from ever having federal funds again for sponsored research? The one strike you're out kind of thing? No, we're just asking opinions here. That's what this whole thing is about, is people's opinions and how they view things and how they think through them.
I think it depends on the egregiousness of the act. For me personally, as far as to dictate whether it is a permanent can't ever, or whether there's an opportunity for them to be rehabilitated and then have another chance to apply, but maybe have to disclose, their previous issues. So that way the person actively knows the type of relationship they're getting into with providing funding.
That's the way the U.S. government handles it at the present time, is that indeed they go through a hearing process and then certain things are meted out to them.
I think, I was gonna say that kind of parallels with the student misconduct.
Yeah.
And how well that, it's not, oh, one strike and you're out, but it very clearly defines, you made a mistake this time. Okay, you're still making, but it grows with the number of mistakes and what they've done. So I think something like that, similar for researchers, where it's, well, what did you do this time? Was it
What did you do this time?
a,
No, you're right. You're absolutely right that that's what people think. Yes.
No, I think the second and third point, if you allow the person to engage in research, then everybody in this world, all researchers will say, hey, let's do it the first time, because the first time we are caught, we'll always never get second chance. So that's like tons of research. In fact, in FF.
Okay. So you think that might encourage people if they knew they weren't going to get banned?
The first time, yeah, they're going to be just penalized or prevented from engaging in research the first time. They say, okay, you can do, whatever. The first time you're caught, you're not going to penalize it. So everybody's going to be until they're caught the first time.
I don't know anybody, at least with regard to the federal government and federal funding, who has been found guilty who hasn't had some repercussions. And the egregiousness does enter into what happens. But the most common thing is that they will agree not to accept federal funds as the principal investigator for a period of 3 years, sometimes 5, and that the institution that they're working for has to submit an assurance that all of their work will be overseen by somebody to make sure that it doesn't happen again. Okay, so we've got this poor investigator who is told you can't work on federally funded projects of any kind for 3 years. And they're a postdoc, and their only funding is from federally awarded funds. Is it right to take away their livelihood and maybe affect their family?
I think kind of, that they did.
Okay.
Like by them doing the misconduct, especially if it's knowingly, I guess with some of our students, I always think like, oh, well, maybe they didn't quite know what they're doing. But in this case, man, that was the risk they took, right? If it goes back to, could you live with this? Well, obviously not. You got caught.
Yeah, and misconduct does have to be, in order to be found guilty, you have to do it knowingly and recklessly, or recklessly. So you brought up a good point there. That's right. I am trying to put you on the spot to see this is what you get into when you get into research. And the number of scenarios is just almost, well, it is, go on ad infinitum, as many things as you can. But if they're found guilty of research misconduct, is it all right to let somebody sue them then and want money back from them and maybe even put them in jail? Is one punishment enough?
No, it depends on what was the fallout from it. Like if it was just, they published some research that maybe, I don't know, I guess it didn't hurt anyone, kind of had research implications in their field, but didn't necessarily, like we talked about the human subjects, right?
Didn't injure anybody this year, but maybe 20 years from now it might,
That brings in a lot of gray where it's not clear yes or no. It's just there's just going to be a lot of legal money going into legal court, and they're just going to prove no, it's not big, and it just happens. So probably it's just best to have like yes, yes or no. That's you did, no matter how small, because some of the researches that were done like many years ago, it's like foundational to some big research later on. So that is false, and it just kind of crumbles.
And all of you are right. See, there aren't any wrong answers because of what integrity is and the fact that personal responsibility always plays into it. There are things that are legally correct, that are correct according to policy, that are correct according to procedure, but we're humans and that human element comes in, and that's where the definition of just being a good citizen. What would a good citizen do? You know, the front page test.
Sorry, just wanted to touch on the first point in the previous lecture.
Sure.
Actually, I am from economics background, so usually we don't do a lot of, I mean, fabrication is not hard because there might be some falsification, but generally, people report why we are not including it. In general, it's very common. But in our field, there's also this case where they just provide data, and should they be included? And I think some of the journals are coming very straightforward that has everybody has taken part in conceptual framework discussion. Data is something like it's not a big deal in the sense that you can buy data, like survey data, NHANES and all. They provide data, so just providing data should not require. But I mean, this is because I'm in economics. I think I'm not so much covered under FFP here that you're mentioning.
No, we'll get to you in a minute. Yeah, we'll get to you in a minute.
Okay.
But you're right, and in every discipline right now, big data is a big deal. And you can buy or download for free from huge databases just about anything you ever wanted to know about any subject or person. And then you get back to thinking, did the person who put that data in there conduct their research properly to get the data? So this can have a ripple effect all the way through, and that's something you should keep in mind when you're making decisions, is the idea that this could ripple for a long, long time. All we have really is our reputation with regard to research. And if we start getting caught doing things that are inappropriate, not just illegal, inappropriate, suspect, etc., then we begin to erode that reputation that we have, that our research and the outcomes are reliable. So when you bear that in mind, when you're thinking about these things, it's what about the guy behind me? What about the guy in front of me? And of course, if the guy behind you did it, there's no way for you to know that. But you do have to bear in mind that you have an obligation to record data appropriately and to pass it on appropriately. There have been plenty of cases where people didn't want somebody else to have access to their data, so they left out some points. Not a good idea. Human subjects research. This one's interesting to me because the federal government performed a miracle. That's the only way I can say it. All of the federal agencies got together when it came to protecting human subjects, and each one of them has their own little section in the Code of Federal Regulations, and they're called the Common Rule, and it's a common set of regulations about how human subjects will be protected during research. At the moment, that's during research that's funded with federal funds. They're thinking about expanding that. Research protections came about shortly after World War II with the Nuremberg trials and all of the Nazi biomedical investigations in the concentration camps. And people wanted to try to make sure that didn't happen again. And so there was a worldwide movement to get a consensus on what was and wasn't appropriate with doing research with human subjects. The federal government came up with this thing called the Common Rule, which is a single body that's exactly the same up through the first subpart for every single agency. The NIH one, in case you're wondering, is, or in case you'd someday like to look it up, 45, Code of Federal Regulations 46. And no matter what agency you go to in the code, it will be there. But our federal regulations and most of the countries that have regulations governing human research subjects are based on ethical principles that came out of those trials at world meetings then. Respect for persons, meaning, first of all, that you have a right to choose whether or not you want to be in research. Beneficence, which means, and it's sort of like the Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm. But it goes even further, saying that you will minimize even the risk that they will be harmed, and to the extent that you can, maximize their benefits for partaking in the research activity. And then there's the justice thing, which is those who bear the risk should be the ones who get the benefits. We've had a lot of disparity in medicine, even in this country, because when you're doing human subjects research on drugs, there are a lot of physiological differences between male and female, if you haven't noticed that. And there are things like women being pregnant, and then there are unborn babies to worry about. And so in many, many years past, pharmaceutical companies would try new drugs just on males of a certain age. Well, females have heart problems too. And they may not react the same way that a male does. So this justice is those who bear the risk should share the benefits, is that you shouldn't configure your research such that a group that is not tested, that is not included in the protocol, is left out of the benefits of that research simply because it was too dangerous for them, you didn't want to take the time, you didn't want to spend the extra money, you couldn't get them to volunteer. You should not exclude people just because of special activities that you might have to take or costs that you might have to incur if there are people who could benefit from that research. The question has always been thought, and I've been doing this for a while, I admit I'm an old lady, whether or not this human subjects regulation should be restricted only to biomedical or psychological research. Right now, human subjects research includes any investigation where you're collecting personal identifiable information from or about a living individual. A lot of people are saying, that's ridiculous, what I do doesn't hurt anybody. Economists say, I'm doing economic research. How is it going to hurt them if I survey all these people about how much money they make and where they work and whatever? Well, risks are not just physical or psychological. They could be financial. You do a survey and somebody gives enough information about their income that the IRS can immediately tell they're living beyond their means, or the CIA can. You've actually put them in danger. Granted, they made that mess themselves, but you've put them in danger of being exposed. So they should be informed right away what the benefits to them might be and what the risks might be. And if possible, it's probably a good idea to keep it anonymous, to keep their answers anonymous. My favorite one is that I can admit on a survey anywhere that I killed my ex-husband and buried him in concrete under the back porch, which I didn't do. Let's be clear about that. I did not do that. But as long as that information is given out totally anonymously, there's no risk to me, the participant. I can go ask 1 million people if they killed their spouse and buried them under the back porch. And as long as the information is taken and recorded in such a way that they can never be identified, then there is no risk to them. So when you're asking people, you have to think about letting them know what they're getting into. We could go into a big long thing on what you need and should tell human participants before they engage. But it is just critical that they know what they're getting into. And that means that we're back to, okay, they're not having heart surgery, and they're not taking a drug for Alzheimer's. They're simply asking questions about their farm from last year or the last 10 years. Should that be included as a human subject's protection? Should they be treated like the person who's getting the heart transplant or whatever?
You still need to be informed, but the risks are obviously quite different.
They're different. Are they any less?
Yes, in my opinion, yeah. But, I would much rather someone ask me about my yard work than perform heart surgery on me. Thinking about it from sort of a view.
You brought up an interesting one, and again, what I'm trying to get to you is that there are lots of rules and regs, but you're still going to have to think. And the yard work was an interesting one, and we actually had to have some people reconfigure a survey where the participants gave their name and their lot number and where they lived and so forth, because two of the questions would have had them admitting to unlawful acts. And one of them was, did they clean up animal waste appropriately? And the other was, did they dump spent hydrocarbons or did they take them to a recycle place? Dumping them on the ground is an EPA violation and can get you big, big fines. So their dumping isn't a research thing, but your survey is. Is it okay to ask somebody to enroll in a research project where they won't get any benefits out of it? I see a yes.
It's a very, very common in economics, especially where you want to control group. Because incentives really drive response sometimes, so you want to make sure that doesn't happen.
There's been a lot of surveys that come through email and they explicitly say there are no known risks or benefits.
That's right. And so, yeah, and it may be just fine, as long as you tell them that, and that, again, is an ethical thing. Because there's no law that requires you to do that, because the federal laws at the moment refer only to federally funded research. So what's the right thing to do? The right thing, obviously, is to tell them what's going on, tell them what might happen, tell them what they might get out of it, and let them decide. What if it's an infant or a mentally challenged person and their guardian or adult makes that decision? If the person can't consent for themselves, is it all right to let some other party consent if there's a risk to them?
For infants, of course, the researcher should decide if it's going to be the infants are going to be at risk or not. Whether even they should ask the guardian or parent to actually consent. Shouldn't the researchers actually know about themselves? Okay, it's not just the guardian saying, yeah, sure. There's so many bad parents out there.
Well, sure. And yeah, and the most common thoughts on this are that obviously these people can't consent for themselves. And so somebody needs to make a decision because the research will benefit somebody or it won't be done. The whole purpose of research is to benefit somebody. It may not be monetary. It may be a job as a tenured faculty member, but all research has some reward to it. And so the general consensus is that sure, it's okay to have people who can't consent for themselves. The quandary comes in as to whether it's okay when there's a great risk to them, yet they won't benefit. Assume it's an infant dying of a leukemia that's virtually untreatable at this point. Is it okay to try a new drug on that infant with holding out hopes of benefit for other infants? It's a tough one, isn't it?
Wasn't there a case of a famous company, I don't know where it was, maybe Wisconsin or something, they actually did, and the child actually died.
Yeah. At this point in time, with special reviews and oversight, that sort of thing can be done, but it is extremely difficult to get that approved. What about people who are virtual, quote, captives? What about prisoners? Should they be allowed to participate? Should they be required to participate?
Allowed and not required.
Yeah.
It's still that free will and that informed consent aspect of it.
Should they be offered early parole for participation? Ah, but early parole from what? Littering or from murder? Exactly.
Certainly we have high responsibility.
Exactly. I'm just trying real hard to be mean to you to see exactly. I mean, nobody can envision these when they write rules and policies. Here's one. Is it okay for your instructor to take your work as a research piece, as data, without telling you they're doing it? Your essay? I mean, it's pretty obvious that your thesis and dissertation are off limits, but what about photographs that you took for a class presentation in, I don't know, English 101?
I mean, that's why the IRB exists, right, is you ask them, so because I'm trying to think of a situation where maybe sort of after the fact, you're like, oh, I want to see what references these students use. It might be hard to get a consent at that point, but maybe through the IRB they can, because you're not using the students' ideas, right? But you're maybe analyzing some.
And there may be ways to do that, and there are some exemptions for things like that. But it is not uncommon to read about people taking students' essays on Emerson and putting them all together and putting them on a website and taking excerpts from them as a teaching tool to show other students.
That makes me cringe. No.
Yeah, okay. But if nobody knows you wrote it, does that make it different?
Like as the instructor, you mean?
No, you the student. If the instructor does that in such a way that you can't identify which student wrote what, or even what class, does that make it different?
It doesn't.
But actually in like sociology or economics, for example, it's becoming more common, especially in grad courses, that they'll have one course where they're asked to write a research assignment, where essentially this student, they just go through all this hard work, putting their best effort to come up with a great idea, and some professors just take it from there and just tweak and do something, and the student of course wouldn't even know because it's being published somewhere else, and it's I think it's a good strategy from the instructor point of view. It's not right.
Okay, well, I will only say two things on that because I don't know who did what, but if they actually took your words and your written writings and they did not credit you, that's plagiarism. If they stole your idea without crediting you, that's plagiarism. If they simply went, the student makes a good argument for Christmas trees being a good thing to grow in August. I wonder if I could apply that to maple trees in the summer, then that's a different situation altogether. But personally, my feeling about that is that if you have something a student did, and this is just my feeling, that outside of plagiarism, that belongs to the student. That's their intellectual property.
Could you use an example from Illinois where there was a student who was bad in writing. So but the basic idea, the crux is there. That was a student, and then a supervisor or an advisor or somebody saw such a bad writing something, and then he just takes the basic idea and then presents it altogether differently and doesn't even give credit to the student. So, that's a point of discussion. For me, that's unfair, but I don't know.
Well, and students often feel that they're at a disadvantage because they can't complain or they won't be allowed to graduate, or they'll be penalized in some way.
In this case, I think the student complained, but they saw the two manuscripts and they said that, oh, it's totally different. Even though they did not buy the argument that basic crux is just the same, like the data, the basic data is.
Yeah.
What about turn that into medical professionals? Is it okay for doctors and nurses and dietitians to use patient records without their permission for research? What if they do it anonymously? What if they go through the charts and they record things that they're looking for, but don't record any elements that will identify that patient?
The patient would still need to be notified, wouldn't, I mean, as with the other cases, the yard work.
Yeah.
Have you been to a doctor in the last couple of years? Have you read your HIPAA compliance thing that they give you?
No.
Mayhaps you should. 99.999% of them say that the practice will be allowed to do that.
Well, I was notified. I was notified, I signed it.
No, without notifying.
Well, so
Yeah.
that is the notification,
That is the-
right?
yeah.
Us,
Yeah.
barely skimming over a sheet of paper and signing our name, I guess we were notified, right? So
You-
before the fact,
You were notified that they would do it without your,
other knowledge, yeah.
Other knowledge. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
okay. Is it okay to lie to participants about what they're doing because telling them might influence their behavior?
That happens a lot in like psychology type research, doesn't it? You know, they'll tell them after the fact, but you don't want to disclose everything because of what you're trying to test.
Yeah.
This is another all right sometimes, not all right sometimes, okay? I mean, if you want to know how they'll respond to the taste of salt, but you give them 3 drinks that you say to them, I want to know if you like the sweetener that's in them. And then, because you know they may try to sort out the salt kind of thing, then no big deal, no big harm as long as you tell them afterwards. And I honestly believe that. But one of the most famous activities like that was here in the United States, where they solicited participants from the public, and they brought them in, and they said they were pairing them up, but one of the pair was the participant, the other was a grad student or a faculty member. And they said, we're going to put you in 2 different rooms, and to the participant, and you're going to be the guy asking the questions, and he's going to be the guy answering the questions, and he's all wired up, and anytime he gets a question wrong, you have to shock him by pushing this switch. And each time, the shocks will get stronger and stronger, and you do run the risk of killing. And many, many, many people did that. They actually did that. Now, the guy wasn't getting shocked. He wasn't getting harmed. But only one person stood up to them and said, I'm sorry, I'm not doing this anymore. I just heard that guy scream. I don't care what you want. The question was it all right to go ahead and do something that drastic? I mean, you leave people ostensibly wondering if they killed somebody. Probably not, but again, it's a moral issue. I mean, people could argue, well, they only get a slight buzz, and a lot of people would feel fine with that. And they go, okay, as long as it's a slight buzz, no big deal. He said it was okay with him. Okay, if he says it's okay with me. But that's, again, a judgment call. Is it okay to just collect private, personal information about a person in general without their consent? Trick question. It doesn't say identifiable private personal information. Does it matter if it's not identifiable?
Trying to think of a context.
Well, I'm just, if it's private and personal, I mean, I'm thinking of 7 degrees of separation. Like, it may very well be private and personal, and it's not identifiable, but it just takes one person being able to pick up on some of those personal information to be able to be like, well, that's Susie from down the road.
Well, that's true to some extent, but there are, of course, ways to get private personal information without collecting identifiable information. We go through that a lot with IRB, where they say, well, I didn't ask for their name. No, but you said there were 15 people in the class, you said there were 7 girls, there were 3 guys, you said there was 1 Polynesian, there were 2 redheads, and you're asking for all these demographics on your form. So there's a difference, of course, then between anonymous, not telling anybody, and not identifiable. And many people will make the argument that as long as the information is not identifiable, it's okay. We get into something called second-party participants, where you're doing a study of, pick somebody, teenagers, and how their parents treat them. And they fill out surveys and answer questions and so forth, and they tell about their parents and their uncles and how many times they've hit them and whether or not they drink a lot and have they ever seen them do drugs. Well, you're collecting personal private information about an individual who may have no idea you're doing it. Is that all right? Do you have to consent the parent or the spouse or the whatever? I get a lot of frowns from you. Yeah.
Well, I'm trying to think of a context in which it would be all right. Because to me, it sounds like no. I mean, if you want information on a person, you ask that. It's only the person who can give consent. I mean, obviously, we talked about the situation in which people can't, right? Like mentally can't or aren't
Right.
with the capacity,
Right.
and that's different. But with this situation, it's
Yeah.
yeah. I'm just trying to.
Well, you know, when you're working with minor children, in this state it's 18 and under, Alabama's 19 and under, you have to have the parents' consent in addition to the child's assent. And if you're asking, if you're studying a group of children with a specific problem, and you're trying to figure out what variables might have entered into that child's problem, whether it's a phobia or, you know, whatever, a psychological issue, you're going to ask some probing questions about their environment, the people they live with, and so forth. And so if they're a minor child, then you're going to have that person's consent when you say, is it all right for your child to participate? This is what we're going to ask your child to do. But when it's spouses in abusive relationships, you're not going to have that consent, and that becomes an interesting issue. Government regulations apply to both federal, let me see, did I skip one? No, there we go. Government regulations for animal research, which is another one of these where we get into research integrity. Government regulations also apply, by the way, to non-federally funded research. That's a dichotomy from human subjects. The big issues there are that animals can't consent. We draft them. I'm not even going to try to get into the ethical issues of animal use in research in here because people feel so strongly about it. And some people feel it's never right, and some people feel it's always right. But always bear in mind that animals cannot consent on their own, and that the research that animals engage in more often benefits the humans than the animals. There is some animal research where it's for food, nutrition, health, whatever of animals, but by far it benefits more. The government regulations that we have that apply to animal research speak very distinctly and strictly to the benefits to the animals and to how those animals are treated. They have to have excellent medical, veterinary care, food, shelter, kindness, absolutely no mistreatment of any kind. There are plenty of animals on the street who would love to be in our animal quarters, believe it or not. But I'm not going to try to talk you into or out of animal research. I'm just saying that federal regulations cover it and that it's a very hot topic. And you come up to the same issues that you did with humans. Is it all right to do it? Is it all right to do this? You know, are there some animals that should never be used in research, like primates? Is it all right to use them if there's another way to do it that you wouldn't have to use animals? Acidic fluid contains these things called monoclonal antibodies. And it's very important in fighting some diseases. And we used to get it by injecting an antigen into the peritoneum of the mouse and tapping the liquid that accumulated. Now we don't have to do that. We use a cell culture technique called a hybridoma. It's a little more expensive. Is it okay to use animals just to avoid the expense? That's the kind of questions that you get into there. If you get into research where the pain and suffering can't be alleviated or treated, is it okay to go ahead and do the research anyway? If you know it's going to put them in pain that you cannot, for purposes of the research, give them painkillers for or relieve the pain, is it okay to use it? It's another one of those tough questions. I don't mind saying my answer is no, but that's my answer. And the feds feel that way too. The feds feel that way too. And the feds say if you have to get to an endpoint where you can't, then the minute you reach that endpoint, you have to end the research right then and either treat the animal or give it relief or whatever. Another thing that we cover here and everywhere is conflict of interest. It has 3 different areas that we look at: financial gain, work commitment, and intellectual and personal matters. And conflicts of interest aren't inherently bad. Sometimes they can make you work harder. If you invent something at the university and the university licenses it to a company that you develop just to bring that to market, then you're probably going to be more likely to work harder to get that thing going into the public. But there may be some management issues. For instance, you own a company and you're on the faculty here or you're a postdoc here. Should you be allowed to take money from your company to do research at the university? Frown, frown. Well, what? Yeah.
So is your question like you're already employed in the university?
Uh-huh.
as a faculty,
And you have a company on the side.
and then you're paying your own self extra money, or what is that?
Well, that might be one of the things to worry about. That's the problem, is that you have 2 loyalties then. How do you know that this individual will say, the company, I can do this for $20,000, and the company pays the $20,000, and that individual goes ahead doing more and more and more with university money because they are what they are? There's a potential conflict there that has to be managed. Potential conflict with your students working at your company. If the company's going real well and the students got the best ideas anybody's ever had, you might, and I'm not saying anybody did this here, don't get me wrong. I'm saying these are the things that they worry about in the regulations. Your student goes to work for your company and is doing a bang-up job and figured out how to improve it, whatever it is they're working on, a whole bunch. You might just be tempted to keep the student working on his or her thesis or dissertation a little longer so they'll stay at your company to finish the project there. That's another concern that comes up pretty frequently. Publishing, and I think I mentioned this a little bit before, a pharmaceutical company comes to you and says, we wrote this paper extolling our new drug, and we know you need to get so many authorships a year, so we'll let you do the authorship if you'll read through it and take credit for it. Should you tell in the publication that you didn't do the research, that you simply are reviewing the data? Or should you say, well, not only did I do this research for this company, but I also get paid $100,000 on the side as a consultant? Yeah, yeah. Eddie?
I was actually asked that.
Uh-huh,
Any financial compensation, if financial
Right.
disclosure is separately with conflict of interest.
right. But what about the time thing? Because I mentioned some other things, time commitment. You know, how many hours a week can you spend working at your company when you've got a full-time job at the university? What's fair? What's reasonable? What's 100% of your effort if you work another place?
That happens these days, like in economics, there's so many other institutions,
Uh-huh.
like IZA or NBER, so people are jointly, they get some money just by affiliation,
Hmm.
but then nobody asks like, okay, it requires this much. All
Right.
they have to do is acknowledge, and they get financial compensation.
Huh.
So
Well,
I'm not sure, but
yeah.
here, I don't know if it's.
here, our policy actually says that if you gain financially from an outside source, that you have to report that outside source. There are some exceptions. Your mutual funds in your retirement don't count, but consulting that you do, second jobs that you take, et cetera. And there are some very strict limits on the number of days that you can be at that other place doing work, and some very strict limits on what you could use here at the university to do that work. And and I know we get several thousand of them every year, and they have to update them periodically throughout the year as things change. I mean, not everybody gets a job on September 1st. You know, they might have nothing to report on September 1st, but Christmas comes, they spend all their money, and they start doing a little extra on the side. So we have these coming in all the time. And the policy is on the web. You can certainly go and look at it. But even things like somebody paying your travel. You know, we have a rule that if a single organization outside the university pays you $5,000 or more in aggregate, just as reimbursement for travel, you have to report that and what you did for it. So we have some pretty tight, locked down conflict of interest regulations to literally protect the university's integrity, the taxpayer money, the students, everybody, actually. Okay, are there any questions about any of this or any issues that you're interested in that you wanted to ask me about?
Actually, I was interested more on the authorship because I come from economics background.
Oh,
Like,
well,
there's more to say.
actually, you have a session on authorship coming up, don't you?
There's one, well, not specifically authorship, but just plagiarism in general.
I thought I saw one on authorship. Bobby
There's one
darn.
on copyright that was yesterday through Global Campus.
Okay, yeah.
And then the graduate school's doing one on thesis and dissertations
Mm-hmm.
tomorrow afternoon.
Yeah, that must have been in the early things when they were, yeah. Authorship varies, as I said, from discipline to discipline with regard to what's right and wrong. But more and more people are getting away from the idea that everybody who ever talked to you gets a guest authorship on that in a certain row. Generally, these days, most people think that you have to materially contribute to the publication. And that doesn't mean collecting the data. The publication is totally different from the data. Helping writing it, vetting it, the whole 9 yards. Do we get complaints about authorship a lot of times? I have to tell you that most of the things that I see when somebody thinks there's research misconduct going on is an authorship dispute. It's not fabrication, it's not falsification, and it's not plagiarism. And so misconduct policies, federal and state and the university, don't address disputes over authors. But we do, that's probably the most common thing that we see is that it's not really misconduct, it's a dispute over authors.
These kind of
Yeah.
workshops should be
I believe, yeah. Let me see if I'm hooked up automatically to the web here. There is I usually hook up to, yeah, I'm hooked up to UA Secure. What am I doing? That's not what I want to do.
Well, now too with research, having to say what percentage you've done within a project or within a publication on our checklist.
Yeah, some journals have
Yeah.
data in
Right.
research questioning, conceptual
Um,
analysis, those are separate.
Yeah.
That's actually helpful.
Yeah, I think
Here's what they did.
Yeah.
somewhere here, we have somebody who's become pretty much a well-respected expert on plagiarism.
Oh, response.
And I thought that that was published on the website. But, yeah, right here, authorship and publication. If you go to the Research Compliance website, just type in rscp.edu, .uark.edu, no www, just rscp.uark.edu, and pick on the Responsible Conduct of Research link. It'll take you to this training series that's on the web. Okay? And I think I'm the only RUF at the university, so if you forget where that is, just Google RUF in the directory and I'll point you to it again. Anything else?
Matthew, why don't we make this mandatory for all the faculty and staff?
Because I value my life.
Actually, especially like being in grad school, we see that supervisors give money and they're like they just want to be co-opted. They hardly do anything. So what is?
Yeah. Well, actually, for a number of people on campus, these things are mandatory. And for the ones that are mandatory, the grad school has some minimal things now that you have to do. And for federally sponsored research activities, if you're going to be a grad student on those to get a stipend or anything, then you are required to complete the
Or even like certification?
Yeah, you're required to complete the, we have online training, and you're supposed to complete those modules before you're allowed to work on those federally funded projects.
Actually, I know people who just, I don't know if the cities that I'm like HIPAA certified because I work on child BMI in Arkansas. And so there are some people who just go on taking. Okay, if it's
Well-
wrong, then go back and just write the answer without even reading.
Let me see, what were we talking about here? Research integrity, isn't that what we were talking about here? Look, there are some people who just do things like that. There's no way in the world we could ever sit down and make sure that everybody completes it. We can only encourage them. And then we can do presentations that show things like, Federal Register notices that say, Ms. So-and-so, a former graduate student at the University of XYZ, was convicted of research misconduct. There's only so much we can do. I understand what you're saying. And the other thing is that we tend to place requirements to the minimum that we have to, because when you require somebody to do something, that's not necessarily going to get you the best effort. I come from an age, and no, I wasn't writing on stones, let's get that clear, where in college, all the women had to take a team sport, an individual sport, a dance class, and I was born with 2 left feet. I took the dance class, but believe me, my heart wasn't in it, and it showed. They made me take it, I'm a microbiologist. I really didn't want to learn how to two-step or do ballet. So there's, we try to keep mandatory things as low as possible and instead encourage people to reach out. Anything else? We actually ran over. I apologize for that. Well, thank you for coming. If you have questions, like I said, get in touch with me.